The note arrived on a silver tray at 9:30, and the Duke of Avermere read it without rising from his chair. Eleonora watched his face from the doorway of the long gallery. She had learned, in 9 years of marriage, to read that face the way a sailor reads a sky, and what she saw now was not anger and not grief. It was relief. The relief of a man who has been handed the excuse he has been waiting 3 months to find. "The contract is settled," he said, and set the paper down. "Lord Carow has agreed to the terms. Vivian will come to Avermere before the Michaelmas quarter." He spoke the girl's name the way one names a horse newly bought. Vivian. 17 years old with a dowry of £40,000 and a grandfather who sat in the House of Lords. Eleonora was 31, and her dowry had been spent 8 winters past on the draining of the East Meadows, which had given Avermere 200 more acres of barley and not 1 shilling of gratitude. "And me," she said. It was not a question. She had stopped asking him questions long ago. "There is a house in Wales, Llanfair. It is yours for your lifetime. 3 servants, the income from the home farm." He did not look at her. He was looking at the contract, at the careful clerk's hand that had drawn up the terms of her disappearance. An annulment is impossible, but a separation quietly arranged harms no one. You understand the necessity." She understood. She understood that a duke with no living son was a duke building his own ruin, and that a barren wife was a door he could no longer afford to keep shut. She understood that he had counted the heads of his cattle and the acres of his wheat and the silver in his strong room, and counted her among the liabilities. "When?" she said. "Friday, the carriage at dawn." Now he looked up, and for one moment something old moved behind his gray eyes, something that might once have been tenderness, before he had taught himself to do without it. "Eleonora, I did not choose this. The estate—" "Do not," she said very softly. "Tell me what you did not choose." She turned and walked the length of the gallery, past the portraits of 7 dead dukes of Avermere, and she did not let him see her hands shake until the door was shut behind her. In her own room she did 3 things, in order, the way she did everything. First, she took down the locked diary from the false bottom of her writing desk, a small book bound in cracked green morocco, the brass clasp worn pale, where her thumb had pressed it 10,000 times. Inside it she kept no secrets of the heart. She kept numbers, 9 years of them, the yield of every field at Avermere, in bushels to the acre, the price of wheat at the Mark Lane Exchange, season by season, the names of the tenants and the dates their leases fell due, the cost of the new threshing machine the Duke had refused, and then, 2 years later, bought at twice the price after she had proven on paper that it would pay for itself in 3 harvests. She had run this estate. She had run it from a writing desk in a room he rarely entered, and not one man in the county knew her hand was on the reins. Second, she counted the money that was truly hers, not the marriage settlement which the law had folded into his, but the small private fortune her own mother had tied up in trust before the wedding, beyond any husband's reach. £800. It was not a duke's fortune, it was enough. Third, she sat by the cold grate and did not weep. She had used up her weeping in the 2nd year and the 4th and the 6th. She had none left for the 9th. She thought, sitting there, of the worst winter, the 5th, the year the murrain came through the home herd, and the cattle began to die. The Duke had been in London. The steward had wanted to slaughter the whole herd at once and sell the hides for what they would fetch, and panic had run through the men. It was Eleonora who had walked down to the byre at midnight in pattens and a man's greatcoat, and stood in the steam and the stink of sick beasts, and given the orders. Separate the sick from the sound. Burn the dead. Do not skin them. Move the sound herd to the high pasture, and keep them off the low wet ground where the contagion lived. She had read of it in a Board of Agriculture report the Duke had thrown unread into a drawer, and she had done exactly what the report advised, and she had been right. Avamere lost 40 head of cattle that winter out of 400. The neighboring estate, which slaughtered in a panic, lost its whole herd and its credit with it. The Duke came home in the spring, looked at the books, said the steward had done well, and gave the steward £5. He never knew his wife had stood in the byre at midnight. She never told him. That was the year she understood fully and finally that a woman who saved an estate from the shadows would never be credited for the saving, and that the time had come to step out of them. On Friday the carriage came at dawn, and Eleonora was not in it. She had left at 3 in the morning, on the back of the gamekeeper's old gray cob, with the green diary sewn into the lining of her cloak and £800 in a money belt against her ribs. By the time the household woke to find her bed cold and her wardrobes full, for she had taken nothing that could be called the Duke's, she was 40 miles south and asking at a coaching inn near Bristol the price of passage to Lisbon. The Duke of Avamere searched for her for 11 days. Then a younger bride arrived at his gate, and he stopped. The ship was the Mary Ann, a Bristol bark carrying broadcloth and Sheffield steel to the Tagus, and Eleonora paid for a cabin under the name of Mrs. Norris, a widow. She was a good sailor. She stood at the rail in the Bay of Biscay, while the other passengers were ill below, and she watched the gray Atlantic become the blue Atlantic, and she never once looked north. In Lisbon she did not stay. It was the autumn of 1810, and Lisbon was a city living behind a wall. 30 miles to the north, Lord Wellington's army had dug a line of forts and earthworks from the Tagus to the sea, the lines of Torres Vedras, the soldiers called them. And behind that wall, all of Portugal was crowding south, because Marshal Masséna's French army had come, 60,000 strong, to drive the British into the water, and had stalled against the lines and could not break them. The harbor was thick with commissary ships. The streets were thick with men who needed feeding. Eleonora, who had spent 9 years learning exactly what it cost to feed 200 souls and 400 head of cattle through an English winter, looked at an army of 40,000 men with their backs to the sea, and she understood, before most of the contractors did, that the war would be won by whoever could deliver salt beef and biscuit and forage when the roads turned to mud. She did not enlist. Women did not. But the British Army did not buy its bread. It bought it from contractors, and the contractors bought it from agents. And the agents did not care whether the hand that signed the bill of lading was a man's or a woman's, provided the casks were full and the price was fair. She began with £800 and a single contract for ship's biscuit out of a bakehouse in the Alfama, in a steep, crooked street above the Lisbon waterfront, where the ovens never went cold. The master baker was a thick, sweating Portuguese named Faria, who had taken English silver before and thought he knew exactly how much care an English contract required, which was none. Eleonora stood in the heat of his bakehouse on her 3rd morning in the trade, in a plain widow's gown gone gray with flour, and watched him draw a tray of biscuit from the oven a full quarter hour too soon. She picked one up. It bent in her fingers. It should have snapped. "This is soft," she said in the careful Portuguese she had been buying, phrase by phrase from a clerk on the quay. Faria did not trouble to turn around. "It is biscuit, senora. The soldiers will eat it or they will starve. Either way I am paid." "They will eat it," she agreed. "And in 9 days, in a damp cask on a mule's back in the rain, the weevil will be in it, because you drew it soft, and the moisture is still in the heart of the loaf. And then it will be condemned at the depot and sent back, and you will not be paid, because the contract is not for biscuit. It is for biscuit that keeps. Read the clause." She had it folded in her sleeve. She laid it on the flowery table between them, the English and the Portuguese side by side, her own finger on the line. "A quarter hour more in the oven, Master Faria. That is the whole of it. A quarter hour, and a man who eats your bread at Almeida lives, and you are paid in full and paid again." Faria looked at the clause, and at the bent biscuit, and at the gray widow, who had read it more closely than he had, and something shifted in his heavy face. He drew the next tray a quarter hour late. It snapped clean. She paid him a shilling over the price for the spoiled batch, and never once short-weighted him in return. And Faria, who had cheated 3 contractors before her and would cheat the one who came after, baked for Mrs. Norris for 4 years, and never gave her a soft loaf again. She knew, as the men around her did not, that biscuit baked too soft would weevil before it reached the front, and biscuit baked too hard would break the teeth of starving men, and that the difference between the two was a quarter hour in the oven and a careful eye. Her casks were full. Her biscuit kept. Within a year, Mrs. Norris held 3 contracts. Within 2, she held 11, and the commissary officers of 3 divisions knew her by reputation, though most had never seen her face. A widow of unknown family who never failed a delivery, never short-weighted a cask, and never ever sold the same hundredweight of salt beef twice. In an army bled white by swindling contractors, an honest one was worth more than a regiment. There was a man who tried to teach her otherwise. His name was Slade, an Englishman out of Cork, fat and genial and rotten through, who had grown rich brining old horse and selling it to the army as Irish beef, and who came to her one evening in a Lisbon counting house with a proposal and a bottle of port. He found her at a long table by candlelight, the green diary open before her, a brass-cased pocket scale, and a set of trade weights laid out at her elbow, for she weighed her own samples, every cask, and trusted no man's stamp but her own. "You work too hard, Mrs. Norris," Slade said, setting down the port. "A cask of beef weighs what the cooper's stamp says it weighs. Stamp it heavy, ship it light, split the difference. Every man in this trade does it. The army cannot weigh 40,000 casks. It weighs 10 and trusts the rest. There is 4,000 pounds a year in it, clean, and no one the wiser." Eleonora picked up one of her own trade weights, a small brass pound with the assayer's mark cut into it, and set it on the scale, and watched the beam swing true, and laid the weight down again. "The man the wiser," she said, "is the corporal who opens the light cask at the depot at Almeida, with 1,100 mouths behind him, and finds it short by a third. He does not know your name, Mr. Slade. He knows the agent's mark burned into the stave. My mark." She turned the diary toward him, to a page of figures in her own clean hand. I keep an account of every cask under my mark, to the pound. When the army weighs its 10, mine are the 10 that are full, because all of mine are full, and that, not your 4,000 pounds, is why the commissary general sends his contracts to me and not to you. You are selling them 4,000 pounds of theft a year. I am selling them the one thing they cannot buy at any price in this whole rotten trade, which is the certainty that the cask is full. Take your port, Mr. Slade. I weigh my own beef. Slade took his port. Within the year, the commissary discovered the brined horse, and Slade was struck off the lists and went home to Cork a poorer man, and Mrs. Norris took up 2 of his abandoned contracts and weighed every cask. She kept the green diary. The numbers in it changed. They no longer counted bushels of Avermere barley. They counted casks of beef, 100 weights of biscuit, the price of mules at Abrantes, the rate of exchange between the pound sterling and the Portuguese real. The hand was the same. The woman who held the pen was not. She heard news of England the way one hears weather in another country, distant and not quite real. She heard that the Duke of Avermere's young wife had been brought to bed of a daughter, and then a year later of a stillborn son, and that the Duke had begun to drink. She heard that the harvest had failed 2 years running in the West Country, and that wheat had gone to 120 shillings the quarter, and that men were going hungry in the very county where she had once balanced the books. And she heard through a banker's clerk who handled bills from the West and did not know the woman who asked owned the curiosity how much of Avermere now stood clear of debt. When she left, the estate had owed nothing. 900 of its 1,200 acres had stood entirely free, the rest carrying only the old, comfortable mortgage that any great house carried and could pay in its sleep. By the second bad harvest, the clerk reckoned 600 acres free. A year on, 300. The year before she came home to London, the clerk said, shaking his head over his bills. The Duke of Avermere held barely 100 acres of his 1,200 that no creditor had a claim upon, and was borrowing against those. She wrote none of the gossip in the diary, but the acres she wrote, that one falling number 900 to 600 to 300 to 100, she wrote in the margin of a page of figures, each below the last, a column that only ever went down, and she underlined the last of them once and turned the page, and did not let herself feel the thing that was not quite grief and not quite triumph, and had no name in any ledger she kept. The war moved north. Massena starved before the lines and fell back, and Wellington followed him, and the contracts followed Wellington, to Almeida, to Ciudad Rodrigo, to Badajoz with its terrible breach, to Salamanca where the army broke a French marshal in 40 minutes on a July afternoon. Mrs. Norris's casks went with them. By 1812 she was not a contractor. She was the agent the contractors came to, the one who held the chain of supply from the Lisbon quay to the forward depot, and the British commissary general himself, a careful Scot named Kennedy, who trusted almost no one, trusted her. It was Kennedy who first said the thing aloud. They were in his office at Ciudad Rodrigo, a bare stone room with a map of the Spanish frontier pinned to the wall and a single tallow candle guttering on the ledger between them. It was February, and the rains were coming, and Kennedy had a problem he had not yet told her, which was that the Army's cavalry, 6,000 horses across 2 divisions, would eat the country bare within the month, and there was no hay to be had, because the forage contractors had all bought against the spring campaign and were holding their stocks for the high price that hunger would bring. He told her the problem. She turned the green diary toward the candle and showed him that she had already solved it. 3 weeks ago, she said, her finger on a column of figures, I bought the standing hay of the Yelts Valley and the next valley north of it, the whole cut from the farmers before your contractors thought to. I paid 11 shillings the load. They will be asking 40 by April, and your cavalry will be down to grass and dying on it, and the men holding the hay will sell it back to the army at a robbery, except that they cannot because there is no hay left to hold. I have it, 2 valleys of it, dry under thatch, and it is the army's at 13 shillings the load, which is my 11 and a fair 2 for the carrying. The cavalry of 2 divisions, Mr. Kennedy, for the price of a single swindler's profit. The contract is drawn. You have only to sign it. Kennedy took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes and put them back on and read the figures again. And they were true. Mrs. Norris, he said, peering at her over his spectacles, you reckon like a quartermaster general, and you keep faith better than any man I have met in this trade. And I have been in it 20 years. I will say a true thing, and you may take it as you please. You are not bred to casks of beef. A woman does not learn to run an army's belly in a counting house. You ran something larger than this once, and someone was a great fool to let you go. Eleanor closed the ledger. Mr. Kennedy, she said, the only thing I ran was a household, and the only fool in the case has paid for his folly. Shall we look at the question of the mule trains to Burgos? He laughed and let it lie, and they looked at the mule trains. But that night alone, she opened the green diary to its first page, the page she never read, and looked at the careful column of Avamere yields in the hand she had owned at 22, the hand of a duchess who had believed that invisibility was safety, that a woman in the background was a woman out of reach. She had been wrong about that. She had miscalculated in almost every reckoning she had made about herself. She closed the book. The war ended in the spring of 1814, and the world it ended in was not the world that had begun it. The British army that came home from Spain came home to a continent rearranging itself, to congresses and treaties, to thrones being handed about like chairs at a crowded table, and the commissariat that had fed that army, the vast machine of contracts and credit and ships and casks that had kept 40,000 men alive across 6 years and 1,000 miles, that machine had made certain people very rich, not the soldiers, the men, and the rare woman who had held the contracts. Eleanor came back to England in the autumn of 1814 with a fortune, the green diary reckoned at £110,000, and a thing worth more than the fortune, which was a name. Not Mrs. Norris, that name she let fall into the sea off Falmouth, the way she had let her tears fall years before, because she had no more use for it. She came ashore as herself. She did not go to Avamere. She went to London and took a house in Berkeley Square. And within a season the question that ran through every drawing room from St. James's to Mayfair was the same question, asked in 100 careful voices. Who was she? She gave them very little, and she gave it carefully, and she gave the most important piece of it to exactly one person. The Dowager Countess of Marsh was 81 years old, half blind, entirely deaf in the left ear, and the single most listened to woman in London, because she had outlived everyone with a reason to lie to her and forgotten nothing in 60 years of paying attention. Eleanor called on her in the 3rd week, with a particular card and a particular gift. Not flowers, which the old woman could no longer see, but a small twist of the very black tea the Countess had not been able to get through the whole long blockade of the war, which Eleanor's own ships had carried past it. The Countess turned the tea over in her spotted hands and fixed her one good eye on her visitor. "Norris," she said, "there is no family of Norris that I know, and I know them all. Who are your people, girl? Tell the truth. I shall hear it if you do not. I always do." Eleanora told her the truth. She named her own mother's house, not the Avermere name, which she did not speak, but the older one beneath it, her mother's people, a name out of the Marcher country that had been ancient when the conqueror came and had sunk through 3 poor generations, almost out of memory. The Countess went still. Then she laughed, a dry rustle like leaves. "That blood," she said, "older than the king's, and prouder and poorer than a curate by the end of it. I knew your grandmother. She would not curtsy to a royal duke, and was quite right not to. So, a widow of large fortune out of the oldest blood in the Marches, who fed Lord Wellington's army and carried my tea past Bonaparte's whole navy to bring it to a blind old woman who can do nothing for her but talk." The one eye glittered. "I shall talk, child. Sit down and drink your own tea and let me look at you. They'll have the whole of it by Thursday, and the half of them will pretend they always knew." Eleanora sat and drank her tea and let the old woman look at her and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. She had not lied. She had simply learned in the commissariat that the most powerful thing a person can hold is the truth told in the right order at the right hour to the right ear, and that one deaf, sharp, honest old woman was worth more than a season of careful lies. By Thursday the worst of the talk was silenced, exactly as the Countess had promised, and not one word of it was false. By the spring of 1815 she was received everywhere. And then Napoleon left Elba, and the world tilted again, and London filled with the men who would govern the peace. And at the great Congress season balls, among the ambassadors and the field marshals and the restored princes of half of Europe, there moved a figure no one quite knew how to place. For there had been, in the long years of the war, a small German principality on the Rhine, whose ruling house had died without sons, and whose sovereignty the Congress of Vienna had quietly confirmed, not upon a man at all, but upon a woman who had served the Allied cause, who had fed and forwarded and financed, who had held credit when kings could not pay, who had been raised, by the formal act of the assembled German princes and the recognition of the Congress itself, to the rank of Fürstin, sovereign princess, of Steinwald in her own right, with a precedence that placed her in the careful arithmetic of the new German order settling into shape around the conference table, above every duke in England. They did not know in the drawing rooms of London that the Princess of Steinwald and the widow Mrs. Norris and the vanished Duchess of Avermere were one woman. They knew only that a princess had come, that the regent himself had received her, and that when she entered a room, dukes rose. The Duke of Avermere rose too. He simply did not know yet whom he was rising for. He had come up to London for the season older than his years, 43 and looking older. The drink had thickened him and grayed him and put a tremor in the hand that had once been so still. His young wife was 4 years dead. The stillborn son had taken her with him, and he had no heir but a daughter of 5, and the great estate at Avermere was a wreck. The 2 failed harvests had broken him. He had borrowed against the land to cover the borrowing, and the borrowing had eaten the land, and the steward he had hired to replace the unpaid hand of a wife he no longer had was an honest man and a fool who knew oats from barley and nothing else. Avamere ran 1,200 acres, and of those barely 100 now stood clear of any creditor's claim. He had come to London to do the thing his pride had refused for a year, to find money in the form of a marriage or a loan, before the bank at the back of it all called in the note. He found her at the Duchess of Rutland's ball, on the night the courier came from Brussels. The ballroom was the most brilliant of the season. Wellington's army was gathering in the Low Countries against Napoleon, and London was giddy with it. Every man of rank had a son or a brother under arms, and the talk was all of regiments and ridges, and the day that everyone knew was coming. Eleonora stood near the orchestra, in a gown of dark wine-colored silk and the diamonds of a German princess, and around her stood 3 ambassadors and a Russian general, and she was explaining to them, with a precision that made the general lean in, exactly why an army's bread mattered more than its powder. When the Duke of Avamere crossed the room toward the great lady everyone wished to meet, to beg an introduction, he did not know her. 9 years and a great war stood between the woman he had sent away at dawn and the woman in the wine-colored silk. Her hair had darkened from auburn to a deep chestnut, threaded at the temple with gray she did not trouble to hide. Her face had thinned to its bones and hardened into something that was no longer pretty and was a great deal more than pretty. She had stopped being a girl in a coach inn near Bristol, and the Duke of Avamere had no memory of meeting any woman but a girl. The host presented him. "Your Serene Highness, the Duke of Avamere." The Duke bowed, low, the way a ruined English duke bows to a princess who might lend him 40,000 pounds. "Your Highness honors us," he said. "I have heard, all London has heard, of your service to the Allied cause. They say you fed Lord Wellington's army when the kings of Europe could not." "They say a great deal," said Eleonora. And the Duke of Avamere went perfectly still. He knew the voice. He had heard it for 9 years, across a breakfast table and down the length of a long gallery. He had heard it say, "Do not tell me what you did not choose," on the last morning in exactly that register, very soft and very level, the register of a woman who had decided something. The blood went out of his face. The ambassadors saw it. The Russian general saw it. He saw nothing but her, and the room narrowed to the 2 of them as a room does at the precise center of a catastrophe. "Eleonora," he said, "just the name." It came out cracked. "You will address me," she said, in the same soft, level voice, "as Your Highness, sir, until I give you leave to do otherwise, which I have not." The ambassadors did not understand the English of it, but they understood the temperature, and they stepped back, and a small space opened in the brilliant crowd around the Princess of Steinwald and the gray, ruined Duke, who stood before her as though he had been turned to salt. "It is not possible," he said. "A great many things are not possible," she said, "until a woman is forced to manage them. The draining of the East Meadows was not possible until I costed it. The threshing machine was not possible until I proved it. Feeding 40,000 men across the breadth of Spain was not possible. I find, sir, that I have a particular gift for the impossible. You ought to have made more use of it while you had it under your roof." "I searched for you," he said. 11 days? 11 days. She said the number as though weighing it on a scale. I searched for a reason to stay 9 years and never found 11 days' worth. We are even then in our arithmetic. The estate was failing. I had no son. I thought, you thought, she said, that a barren wife was a liability you could no longer carry, and that a girl of 17 with 40,000 pounds was an asset you could not refuse. You did your sums, Your Grace. I will not fault a man for doing his sums. God knows I have done enough of my own. I will only observe that you got them wrong. You sold a 30-pound annuity, she let the figure fall, to buy a 40,000-pound bride, and you have spent the years since discovering that the annuity was the better property. The girl is dead, I'm told. I am sorry for it. She did you no harm and was given no choice, like me. But the books, Your Grace. Look to the books. You let the only person at Avermere who could read a ledger ride out of your gate at 3 a.m, and you have been ruled by fools and your own pride ever since. And now you stand in a ballroom, begging a princess for the loan that an honest accounting would have made unnecessary. I have a daughter, he said. It was the last card in his hand, and he played it badly, the way he had played every card for 9 years. She is 5. She has no mother. You are still before God and the law, I am nothing of yours before any law in England, Eleanor said, and the soft voice did not rise, which was worse than if it had. You sent a clerk to draw up a deed of separation and a house in Wales to bury me in, and I signed neither, and I left, before either could be served. There was no separation, Your Grace. There was an abandonment, and you committed it, not I. The law you would lean on now is the same law you reached for to cast me off, and it will not bear your weight twice. As for your daughter, Yashjaltsiker, she is 5 and motherless and innocent and the only blameless soul in this entire wretched account. Be a father to her. That is not a thing a princess can do for you, nor a loan of 40,000 pounds. It is a thing you must do yourself in the room you never enter, with the child you have. Do not stand in a ballroom and offer me a 5-year-old as collateral. You sold the wife. You do not get to mortgage the daughter? He had no answer. There was none to make. The thing she said was true in every part, and a true thing told in the right order, at the right hour, to the right ear, is the most powerful weapon in the world. And she had learned to wield it from a Scottish commissary general in a stone office at Ciudad Rodrigo, and she wielded it now. How? He managed at last. Did you? I kept a diary, she said. She had it with her. She always had it with her. She drew it from a reticule, the small green book, the cracked morocco, the brass clasp worn pale, and she did not open it. She only held it where he could see it, between 2 fingers gloved in white kid. 9 years of Avermere's accounts are in this book in my hand, she said. Every yield, every price, every lease, every shilling you spent, and every shilling I saved you, and you never knew it was saved? I ran your estate from a writing desk in a room you rarely entered, and you took the fruit of it for 9 years and called me a liability because you had never troubled to learn what I was. That was your single great error, Your Grace. Not the casting off, the not knowing. A man should always trouble to learn what he holds before he decides to throw it away. She closed her hand around the diary. You came to London to find money. I will not lend you money. I do not throw good coin after a badly run estate, and I have spent 6 years learning the difference. But I will tell you what I would do in your place, because I find I am not cruel, only finished, And because whatever else you were 9 years my husband, and there was a season early before you taught yourself to do without it, when you were almost kind. The Duke of Avermere stood in the middle of that gilded room and listened to the woman he had cast aside tell him how to save the estate he had ruined. Sell the home farm and the Welsh house, Lanver, that you offered me as a cage. Let it pay a true debt instead. Pay off the worst of the mortgage with the proceeds and convert the rest to a long annuity at the new low rate. The war is over, money is cheap. You are paying war prices for peacetime credit and have not even noticed. Turn the east meadows back to grass and let them to a grazier. You are growing barley on land that wants cattle, and you have been doing it for 15 years because your grandfather did. Dismiss the honest fool of a steward kindly, with a character and a pension, and hire a Scot. They reckon. And read your own books, your grace. For once in your life, read your own books. In the room you never entered, the woman who kept them is no longer there to do it for you. She drew on her glove, though it was already on. That is worth more than 40,000 pounds, and I give it to you for nothing, which is precisely what your regard for me was worth. We are even now in every ledger I keep. Good night. And the Duke of Avermere, master of 1,200 acres and 7 dead dukes' portraits and 1 living daughter of 5, went down, not in a bow, but lower, his knee touching the parquet of the Duchess of Rutland's ballroom floor, before the Princess of Steinwald, in front of the assembled rank of England, the way a vassal kneels, the way a man kneels who has finally and completely understood the size of his mistake. Forgive me, he said, not for the loan, for the 9 years. The ballroom had gone silent around them. The orchestra had faltered. 100 faces of the first rank in the kingdom watched a gray, ruined duke kneel on the floor before a princess no one could place, and not one of them understood what they were seeing, and all of them knew they were seeing something. Eleanora looked down at the bent gray head of the man who had counted her among his liabilities, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that she had to go searching for the old wound and could not find it. Only the clean, flat place where it had been, sealed over somewhere on the road between Lisbon and Salamanca, without her ever marking the day. He was an old man kneeling on a floor. She had been free of him for years and had only just now noticed. Rise, your grace, she said, and her voice was not soft any longer, and not hard. It was only tired and kind, the way one is kind to a thing that can no longer hurt one. You make a spectacle of yourself, and the orchestra has stopped, and the Russian general is staring. Rise and go home, and read your books, and do better by your daughter than you did by your wife. That is all the forgiveness I have, and it is more than you came for. He rose. He looked at her once more. Really looked, the way he had any trouble to look in 9 years of marriage, and she let him, because it cost her nothing now. Then a courier in mud to the waist came through the great doors with a dispatch from Brussels, and a man shouted Wellington's name, and the whole brilliant room turned away from the kneeling duke and the unplaceable princess, and surged toward the news, and the moment closed over them like water. Eleanora did not stay for the dispatch. She had fed the army that would win or lose on the morrow's field, and she had no more to do with it now. She had drawn her last cask years ago. She went out through the conservatory alone into the cool, dark garden where the noise of the ballroom fell away behind her. She took the green diary from her reticule and turned, by the light coming through the glass, to the first page. the page she never read. The column of Avermere yields in the round, untried hand of a girl of 22, who had believed her only power was the kind you held in secret and could never be seen to hold. She had been wrong about that. She had been so completely wrong. She took the small pencil that lived in the spine of the book, and beneath the last entry of all, beneath the casks and the contracts and the rate of exchange, beneath 6 years of a war and a fortune of £110,000, she wrote one line in the hand of the woman she had become, which was steadier than the hand of the girl and clearer and entirely her own. "The accounts are closed," she wrote, and then she wrote, "and they balance." She shut the book. She put it away. Somewhere to the east, across the channel, the morning was coming up over a Belgian ridge near a village called Waterloo, and the world was about to change again. But that was a ledger she had no entry in. Hers was settled. The Duchess of Avermere had vanished at dawn 9 years before, and the woman who walked out into the garden of Berkeley Square was a princess in her own right, who answered to no one, who had closed every account she meant to keep, and who would never again, as long as she lived, mistake the holding of a thing in secret for the having of any power at all. She walked out into the dark, her back to the lighted windows, and behind her the Duke of Avermere stood alone in a room full of people who had already forgotten he was there.